Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Well, here we go. It is showtime. It's Thursday, February the 20th. 1 month since inauguration. Boy, was that a hairy 4 weeks or what? And things are just going to get funner and funner and funner. And so as we move on, and lots to talk about today on and off the campaign trail. And we have a full freaking house here at On the Ledge, your Ontario politics podcast. And this is, of course, the daily edition. So let's get to it. Keith Leslie joining us, a regular on our Thursday roundtable. Tim Hudak's just wandering around the halls at Counsel Public Affairs. We'll tell you why in a minute. John Wright is here. He is our resident pollster. And John Tory, the former mayor of the city of Toronto. And Bob Richardson in the house as well. And, of course, he is a public affairs consultant. And I don't know that we've had six around the table before, but let's get at it, because a few things. And Bob, I want to start with you, because a couple of days ago, I think we were at the end of the show talking about some of the key important ridings where the leaders are going to be, and that day Bonnie Crombie was in Hamilton appealing to the NDP voters to cast a ballot for the Liberals to, win the war for the purposes of healthcare, etc. And you and Brian Lilly got into, well, where will they be next? And you guys predicted Ottawa. And of course, no sooner had we signed off than it was clear that the Liberal campaign was going to Ottawa. What I want to ask of you is, what do you make of the NDP focusing so much on ridings that should have otherwise, or would have otherwise, thought to have been fairly safe, i.e. Toronto, where things are going?
I think the NDP is in tough. I think they're finding a number of ridings are competitive that they were hoping were not going to be competitive. Ridings like St. Paul, as an example, is competitive. University Rosedale is tight. Obviously, there's a couple in Scarborough that are tighter than they thought. Fort York is another one. So they've got 5 or 6 challenging ridings in Toronto. That doesn't mean that they can't hold them, but it's more challenging than they would have expected. And they're playing a little bit more defense, I think, than they had anticipated doing.
And I think the idea is at this stage of the campaign, John Tory, you got to wonder, I've heard debate back and forth whether it was too soon for Crombie to make the bid or the pitch for NDP voters. If it puts any wind under her wings, it seems to be a good time heading into the final weekend before the campaign wraps up.
Well, if not now, when? There's a week to go. So at the end of the day, it's not too early at all. And I don't think we can underestimate as well on both sides of this, meaning Crombie and Stiles, the impact of what's going on federally. Where Crombie is getting a lift from the fact that they were at the very depths of despair in terms of the federal party standing, and that has an impact, a washover impact on provincial politics. And of course, now you see polls coming out showing the NDP federally as low as like 11 points, which is unbelievable in terms of just what we've been seeing over time. And that can't help but have a negative impact on Mayor Stiles. So, you see this tussle for opposition, which it's got to make Doug Ford feel not too bad. And I don't think it was too early to get into the so-called strategic voting thing at all, just because it's not, this week, then when are you going to do it?
Tim Hudak, the idea that, there was projections out there early on or earlier in the month to suggest that the premier could have won 100 seats. That was sort of the middle of the seat projection and the modeling. Now it's back to, somewhere around 90. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but is he breathing a sigh of relief not having that? He's going to have a larger mandate, but boy, if he'd had 100 or 99 other MPs sitting around him, that might have been a bit of a tough room.
By the way, I got in. So the hardest working guy in the office, Felix Burns, came and bailed me out. Felix, say hi to the On the Ledge audience. Safely inside the Council Public Affairs office. So, okay, no, you actually don't want that many MPPs. I mean, it's good for the record books, right? I mean, 3 straight majority governments. Right, your vote count on your third mandate is crazy. But let me tell you why that's not a good thing. sometimes you can have too many MPPs. So, related story, when Mike Harris won a landslide in 1995, his team, the campaign team, were so pumped up, 82 seats. And then he said to his staff, we're getting some people we don't want. Now, I'll try to take that personally because I think I was number 77 on the list. But you know what? You may get some, there's just so much work to go around. And if you don't occupy these type A personalities, they're going to get into mischief. And we certainly, in the early years, had our share of that. We actually, telling all these tales out of school, one of our MPPs, I think, John, you know who it was, he actually turned his office into a bar. He didn't have an executive assistant. He had a bartender.
Yeah.
So all of the excess members would gather in there. The media would come in. There was a total source of leaks. So, yeah, good for the record books. You don't want to have too many.
Yeah, well, Keith, the idea that you'd have all the new members coming in. I can remember the days when the media gallery, press gallery at Queen's Park would just be, salivating, waiting to be able to watch what they were going to do next or what they were going to do first in terms of coming out of the gate as rookies.
Oh, absolutely. And this is, this is where hay is mowed by reporters. I mean, getting into all those backbenchers. Do you have any expectations of being in cabinet? Really? What position would you like to have? It's just so much fun. And so if a government has, as you say, the projections of 100 seats, which is, Tim says, good for the record books, not for managing a caucus, and not for, Ford has already managed somehow to get virtually every single member of caucus, all but one, I think, extra pay by some sort of appointment, junior minister, whatever. I mean, he's done that. You can't do that if you have 100 members. There's just not enough appointments to give around unless everybody gets a second parliamentary assistant. I don't know if that's going to fly. So it's just fraught with trouble. And of course, people who expect to get promotions, and what politician doesn't expect to be selected for cabinet, well, people who don't get into cabinet tend to bear a bit of a grudge for a while. So they can sometimes be turned into sources by journalists. So, this is what a government knows, and all the people around the government know, so that as, to say that winning a supermajority is maybe not what you want. But we are watching Premier Ford run a classic front-runner campaign. I mean, it's even beyond a classic. I mean, we used to complain they'd put the front-runner in a bubble and we couldn't really get at them. I mean, Premier Ford campaigned in the Niagara region yesterday and refused to tell any media where he was campaigning. This was actual campaigning. He was meeting with some workers at different places. He would not tell the CHCH wanted to send a camera along. It's their coverage area in Niagara. No media were allowed to cover the premier campaigning for re-election 8 days from election day. I've never seen anything like that in my life.
Well, John Wright, when we look at those, the modeling and the seat projections, I know there's some new polling out today. 338, though, still has the range for the Tories between 74 and 106. So the premier still could get what he doesn't really want. And to everyone's point, where we're kind of laughing at, the possibilities of what could happen here, that could be a complete and utter distraction that the next premier of Ontario doesn't need heading into the circumstances we face with the United States.
Well, maybe in the circumstance with the United States, you can create a whole lot new positions that are going to deal with that. It's an extraordinary time. And if you take a look at the polling, especially done by Counsel Public Affairs when they put out the poll, it showed dissatisfaction with most of the other issues and that the government deals with, but it showed 53% of the public squarely behind the Ford government, and that this was the ballot issue, the Trump circumstance. So, I look at it and say, well, not much has changed since the beginning of the campaign, except for two things. Number one, of course, is we have the federal lift that John Tory referred to. It's real. It's hypothetical based on Mike Carney becoming the prime minister. But nonetheless, what's happening is that the Tory vote is remaining about the same. The Conservative Poilievre vote is about the same. But what's being cannibalized is that the Liberals are scooping out the NDP. And that's where the fight is for Bonnie Crombie right now. So she said it at the end of the debate that's what she was inviting the NDP to do, is to cross over the line as is happening federally. But she's now continued the mantra. And she's also stepped up the voltage on what she's saying, because it's cutting through. She's the one, saying things that the media are now picking up on. The other thing it speaks to, though, is the kind of candidates you're going to have in the ridings, and they can make a big difference. I know now in St. Paul's, which seems to be the bellwether for every election, but federally, there's now rumors that Mark Carney may run here. There's polling that's being done that has been speculated on, that even probing for Evan Solomon to run in this riding. So, I mean, you start to bring in good candidates, good local candidates. The Liberals have picked up some good ones. I mean, Stephanie Smythe in St. Paul's is going to give the incumbent NDP, Jill Andrews, a good run for her money. So the lesson here is that local candidates at the end of the day can make a big difference. The only other thing I'd say, Dave, is the one unpredictable portion of all of this is the efficiency of the vote based on the weather. I mean, honestly, if a week from now we have another 8 centimeters of snow on, in areas which have not been plowed out, that is going to cause an issue in terms of some of the voting abilities of people to get out. People might just say, I've had enough, I'm not going out. But I'd watch the weather, because that will, in fact, change the efficiency of the vote for sure.
Yeah, Bob Richardson, when we look at the modeling, and we referenced the idea that, Tories could still win 90 seats given that, but the Liberals and the NDP at 16 seats, that's sort of the middle of the range. But what I find most interesting, to John Wright's point, is the efficiency of the vote, because the Liberals are out polling the NDP by 10 points.
Yeah, I think the Liberal vote is much more efficient than it was last time. I think that was the low water mark. I think it's in a bit better shape this time. And there are some seats that they should pick up this time that weren't available to them last time. Eglinton Lawrence is a good example of that. With the NDP candidate out of that race, it becomes much more likely that Vince Gasparo, the Liberal candidate, has got a good shot at that one. Nepean is one in Ottawa. Tyler Watt is barely lost last time to Lisa MacLeod, a 4 or 5 time incumbent, and he's been at it full time for 6 to 8 months. So those are examples of seats where they're in good shape locally that they should pick up this time. So I expect a better performance by the Liberals in terms of their numbers in the legislature, but obviously not what they want, given the behemoth that is the Ford campaign this time out.
Well, Tim, when we look at the Tory numbers, though, and they really haven't moved a whole lot. The seat projections have changed, but they've always been kind of 44 to 46. There's some outliers there, poking up to the low 50s, but typically it doesn't matter the poll you're looking at in 338 citing. That's sort of where they've sat. It says to me clearly the Liberals are gaining at the expense of the NDP here. What's surprising to me is that there doesn't seem to be any movement whatsoever within the margin of error on the Tory support.
Look, they've run a successful campaign, and that campaign strategically showed good judgment because Donald Trump has been their best friend, right? Every time that the Liberals, New Democrats seem to get a bit of traction, Trump gets on his phone, and then it's all back to protect Ontario. So, I've been out to some campaigns and talked to them on the PC side, and that old adage, Dave, follow the bus. So where is Doug Ford spending his time? His goal right after the debate was to go to Northern Ontario. and then Niagara and Hamilton. So the Conservatives are on offense, targeting really New Democrat seats to bring them over to the blue fold. I think Bob's right that the Liberals have a shot at some Ottawa seats, increase the share there. Bonnie Crombie has been largely around the GTHA, and really, I think, fighting to win her seat as well, right? A lot of resources just to get your leader inside the legislature. The New Democrats totally on defense. But I think right now, I still think they're going to eke out a second place in seats because their vote far more efficient, not spread across the province, but strong downtown Toronto, Hamilton, Niagara, Bid and Windsor, and then Northern Ontario.
So we've already alluded to the note that Bonnie Crombie appealing to the NDP vote, and that is basically, Keith, part of her stump speech right now, and she's repeated it a few times since the debate.
And that's why I'm reaching out today to NDP voters, and I'm asking them, if you want to change our healthcare system, please vote for Ontario's Liberals. And together, we can change the government.
I'm not sure that together they can change the government, but I thought it was interesting last night. Marit Stiles sat down with Steve Paikin, and Steve put that question to Stiles and said, okay, how do you respond to what the Liberals are doing?
Well, honestly, I think it tells you a lot about where the Liberals are at right now. They are trying to form an official party in the legislature again. That's kind of their path. I was saying yesterday, I think Doug Ford quit the election and Bonnie Crombie quit the fight. My focus is on defeating Doug Ford. And I will say also, I think it's unfortunate a little bit because I really do believe that as elected leaders, we should earn your vote. And I think that's a very cynical attempt to convince people that they have to settle for something that they don't have to settle for.
And Keith, we started this whole conversation at the beginning of the campaign suggesting that the Liberals were the ones who were sort of flapping in the wind, had no direction. I think that the sail has been set better for them, and the problem that the NDP has is actually finding that sense of direction right now.
Absolutely. We're not quite sure what they're trying to tell us, what they're standing for in this election campaign. I mean, obviously the basic thing, healthcare and whatnot, but they threw in that buying the 407 thing, which just seemed to come out of left field and something we can't afford. Something to everyone's point about, where they're focusing their campaigns. The NDP are actually having to pay. Our friend Sabrina and Angie reported today, the NDP are paying for door knockers in Hamilton, Niagara, Sudbury, and London, trying to, hold on to the basic areas they've already got. So the NDP campaign, whether it's, being dragged down by Jagmeet Singh and his terrible federal numbers, or whether it's their mixed messaging going on in this campaign, they seem to be having trouble holding on to what they've got. I mean, they seem to be in trouble, whereas the Liberals, absolutely, as you say, have the wind set. The wind is behind their sails. Whether it's going to be enough to get them, I mean, their goal absolutely has to be official party status. I mean, they need to get 12 seats. But they actually are trying to position themselves, with strategic voting. We can become the official opposition, or we could maybe even hold Doug Ford's Conservatives to a minority. I don't think that's realistic, no matter how many NDP votes they lure. But it's not only a regular Liberal tactic to try at this point in the campaign. It's a common sense one. I mean, who are you going to try and vote from? Anyone who supported Doug Ford in the last two campaigns is going to vote for Doug Ford again. He's given them no reason not to.
Well, John Tory, if you think about having to pay the door knockers, what does that say about, sort of that message at the door? Because that's great. I got my $21.30 an hour and I'm going to hand out leaflets. But if, that doesn't guarantee anybody's going to be able to answer a question or make comment on what it is you actually stand for.
No, I think that's a really good point. I mean, we train political parties to people not to get engaged too much at the door, but you do get engaged a bit. Why are you here? What do you know of this candidate? What's their view on a given issue and so on? So there's a bit of it. And people who are paid are not going to be able to do that. Now, I think really the best you can hope for is you get a piece of literature in somebody's hand, which maybe tells them where to vote or some such thing. But look, I mean, this is, what has happened in election after election after election over the last 50 years or 60 years. The Progressive Conservative Party benefited from the fact that there was this tussle going on back and forth between the NDP and the Liberals, and they win with 44%, and they win handsomely. And, I think all this talk about the problem Doug Ford will have if he wins X number of seats, he still, and Tim and I have had the experience of walking in the door that says on the front of it, Leader of the Opposition. It's an honor to serve there, but it's not quite the same as walking in that door that says Premier of Ontario, and one of your problems is caucus management. It's a good problem to have walking in that door.
So I know that the plan is to have the premiers go to Washington and meet with the governors. Hearing a lot about, the governors have got way too much on their plate right now, Bob, for the 13 first ministers to even be on the radar, never been on the agenda for any kind of conversation. In fact, Danielle Smith, I think, is bailed out on the meeting, so it's not even a priority for her anymore. All of a sudden, the whole got to go to Washington seems a little mucky.
Yeah, this is a priority for the election. This is not a priority for the actual topic. This is more about theater than it is substance. But it will proceed because we are in the back moments of an election, and it has to proceed. But the governors are not interested. The Americans, frankly, are not interested in general. I think they will have difficulty even eking out the requisite amount of media that they would want for this. But look, it'll go ahead. it'll burn up the clock for another day in the campaign for Ford in a very safe setting, which I think has been very smart on his organizers and his campaigns front. Basically, there's only been 2 windows since this campaign had started where the opposition had a chance of getting its message out. One was when there was the suspension of tariffs for 30 days, which lasted for about 30 minutes instead of 30 days. So that window didn't happen. And the second window was the provincial debate, and there was a plane crash that day, and that blew that out too as well. So there's been no oxygen in this campaign for the opposition, and a day in Washington is another day with no oxygen for the opposition.
Well, and it's also another day that the media, our media on this side of the border, John, doesn't get to, ask or speak to the premier.
Yeah, and that hasn't really been a problem for the campaign at all going forward. So, but it does leave the door open for the 2 other candidates to get on the map, to do something, to make some noise. And as I said, Bonnie Crombie's done that in the last few days. She's made some comments that have caught, slices in the media, and she seems to be leading that. I'd like to also suggest, the big quandary for me in all of this is Mike Schreiner. I think we have to, all of us would say we all like Mike, and I hope after I say this, he continues to like me, and he's a fine chap. But when I saw him on the podium the other night, and then I saw him yesterday in the media, I don't know what's green about that party anymore. I just think it's Mike Schreiner's party, and it happens to have a label called green. But when you're in there arguing about, infrastructure, budgets, ODSP, like it's just all over the map. It's not even tied to the key element. It means that, getting a couple of seats, maybe getting, yet another one, you got to reflect on that and say, Mike had his chance to be the leader of the Liberal Party. It wasn't that long ago that he was offered almost on a silver platter to come over and do that, and he pondered not to go back to the Green and went back to the Green Party. It just isn't having the impact anymore. It's just got, a small percentage of vote and small percentage of seats. So it's been an interesting campaign watching the Green Party, because he's actually taken it to an area where it's just like a regular party. It's just really small and really green.
Dave, can I just comment on Washington to say one thing? And it won't matter in the big scheme of things, but this is where you might pay a price for going 9 days without talking to the press. And I understand the low bridging and what did you call it earlier on, the front runners type campaign where you keep your head down. But 9 days is a long time. And in Washington, I think it just could lead to a day of very bad stories, where they sort of say the whole meeting was a bust, and back to the points others made that, nobody really cared they were there, and the Doug Ford, wasted time away from Ontario and all this. I don't think it'll matter, but I think it could lead to a day of bad stories just because people are saying, fine, if you're not going to see us, then, we'll write you up in a worse way than might otherwise have been the case.
Tim, you went down and for the first meetings in Washington. Is it really necessary to go for 2?
Yes. Look, I'm going to disagree with my friend from Bob here. Number one, Danielle Smith is probably back home because she's facing a government that's in flames over a health ministry scandal on the awarding of contracts that's calling resignations in her own role, right? So I understand that. Look, this is a roller coaster. This roller coaster is going to have ups and downs, twists and turns for probably at least 6 months. I think every step that you take to talk to governors, to talk to decision makers is going to be helpful. And I disagree too. I think they are listening, but here's the catch. When we were in Washington, D.C., what we heard from American decision makers was, yeah, we agree. Like, we should turn our trade guns on China. We like Canada. You're absolutely right. But I'm not going to stick my head out right now because President Trump, the Republicans, has such momentum. He's, running all over the place. So the countervailing push here is Republicans are afraid to stick their necks out right now, and the president can be vengeful. I think that does turn. So I think every step, it helps Doug Ford in the campaign for sure, but every step to build a connection and drive the message, you got to take advantage of that and help us get to flat track eventually.
So, John Wright, if that's the case, and we all acknowledge that there's a whole lot going on in Washington, but let's just take a step back. All we have right now from the Trump administration are dates. We're going to do this on this date, and everything seems to be pushed out a week or two or a month or whatever it has to be. And I don't know, and others may, whether or not there's been mechanism put in place to actually implement or take care of the tariffs on the other side of the border. What has to happen and all of that. So there seems to be a come soon feel about all of that, and I understand why people are anxious. But when you put that against the backdrop of everything else that's going on, including the war of words between Trump and Zelensky, and Trump's apparent effort to create peace without Ukraine or the Europeans involved, I can see how, in a strange way, that distraction might actually be helpful in terms of what happens with the tariffs.
I suppose that with all of the chaos, it's hard to pick, to keep your eye on one ball that's going on, and especially with the escalation now that it's involving Europe with not just the tariffs, but just the international security dynamics of it all. It's a little bit like the Phil Spector politics world in the sense that it's a wall of sound. Phil Spector did albums back in the 1970s and 80s that were this new way of producing just this wall of sound, and it made a very distinct kind of presence for a band, and it is a wall of sound coming out of Washington nowadays. It is a global wall of sound. And so I think Tim's right, where what you've got to do is you've got to play your cards as many as you can, because you don't know the mercurial nature of this president. He's already said that he was going to bring in 25% on certain things, and then it was pushed out, and then it was, well, we're going to do reciprocal. It was pushed out again. We're into April now before we see what allegedly is going to be just the tariffs alone. But you're right, Dave. I mean, it's not just the tariffs now that occupy our space. It's now northern security. It's across the top of our borders in the north. It's about almost every job that could be affected coming out of the United States. It's about recruiting doctors and nurses from the United States to come into Canada. Everything is now focused on that dimension of geography. So, you know what? It's benefited the premier in that their campaign team understood that the winds could blow in that direction. They picked the horse and they rode it, and they've been very successful at it. But it's not going to end at the end of this campaign. And as I said, the premier may end up with more people, but maybe he's got more tasks, and maybe he's got more things that they can do, even on an interprovincial basis. Because let's not forget that after we're done, if we're going to succeed at being a more productive country, if we're going to succeed at doing something to ballast off of what's happened in the United States, we're going to have to open up those trade barriers between us. And, Pierre Poilievre declaring that within 30 to 60 days of him being prime minister, he would eliminate all of those tariffs, get the premiers together and do all that. We all know from this table that's not going to happen. It's going to have to happen on a case-by-case basis. So maybe Captain Canada Ford is going to turn out to be Captain Provincial Man and also have to do that. And that's going to take a lot of work to start opening up those borders.
Well, Keith, when we look at what's going on provincially, that's important here in this part of the world. I mean, and you being in Atlantic Canada, there's an interesting perspective from each one of the regions, each one of the provinces, because yesterday the story out of British Columbia was, I don't know if it was a throne speech or a budget, but, the whole focus was on protecting British Columbia from the tariffs and Donald Trump. So just, substitute BC for Ontario and you've got the same line.
Well, to the point, I mean, we've had 4 weeks of Trump and Musk flooding the zone with a fire hose of news that pick an issue, ride one. Say, what's important to you, Ukraine, world peace. I mean, it's just so insane. So on the plane last night, apparently it was, forestry products, 25% any forestry products coming in. And again, not clear if that's 25%. It's going to be rolled on top of the 25% that's coming to all goods coming in. Just no knowledge of it. And what are we doing that April 2nd? Around then, maybe, says Trump, maybe a few days later. Like it's not even on the back of a napkin. It's just coming off the top of his head. So how countries are supposed to prepare and react for this, I mean, is just, I guess, basically prepare for anything and everything. And as you say, getting rid of a lot of barriers with, interprovincial barriers, what we've talked about for decades, but have really never, ever achieved very much on that at all. I mean, there needs to be some leadership on that. It can't come from the prime minister. It's 13 provincial jurisdictions. So it's going to be 13 provincial leaders are going to have to, as you say, case by case basis, I think, deal with this sort of thing. But for now, just staying on top of Trump. And of course, everyone is preparing. It's here. The lead of the news this morning was in Nova Scotia was, the Premier Houston is going to Washington. He's going to fight for this, and it's $7 billion worth of trade for this little province. I mean, it's just phenomenal. The stats that are behind all of this, we buy back something like $500 million worth of U.S. goods. So, there's some case to be. So we have to go down there and express why it's so important. And, keep pushing the relationship. So as much as I think it's cynical to have these Washington trips in the middle of the campaign, it not only works for the Ford and the PC campaign, it probably works to Canada and Ontario's benefit as well, just hammering home that message nonstop.
Well, Bob, what I've noticed it has been heightened, and I think the Globe and Mail picked up on this around the Fox interview with Musk and Trump the other day, that Ontario's ads were all over that programming, and CNN. I mean, they're making a lot of dough off of the Ontario ads themselves. But to me, that's an important and an effective message to be pushing those ads into that market.
I think it is, and I think it certainly has heightened the awareness of Ontario, which I think has always been, relatively low with Americans. The one thing I will say, though, is our media has to kind of calm down a little, and others have to calm down a little. We seem to think that we're the only issue that is on the table with the Americans. With Trump. In the last 3 weeks, he has attacked the Ukraine, Mexico, Denmark via Greenland, the EU, Taiwan, Panama, Gaza, and through Gaza, Egypt and Jordan. And Elon Musk took a run at Keir Starmer in the UK. So there's a lot of company. It's a busy agenda. We're only one of about 15 points of attack that is going on in Washington right now. So I don't think we can expect people to be focused hugely on our issues, given the volume of action that's out there. Whether we should be down there or not at the back end of an election, I think is open for discussion. But it's certainly a busy agenda, and in some ways that's good, because maybe we ought to be keeping our head down a little bit.
Well, let me ask you guys this then, because as we move into the final week here, and clearly, I mean, this is generally agreeing it's a race for second, see who gets official party status and moving on. At what point, Tim, does the Progressive Conservative Party, Doug Ford's team, start to say, okay, and spell out fairly directly, here's what our next steps are. Day after election, what has to happen?
Oh, I'm confident that that's already underway. I mean, any leadership campaign is going to, or any campaign will ensure that there's a plan for the transition. And it's easier if you're government and continuity. Oh, I think Doug Ford is going to hit the ground running. I suspect that most of the same cabinet ministers will be in the same portfolios. And that they will immediately go to work. I mean, the crisis, as my colleagues just outlined, is clear. It's present. It is a huge risk. So I say they go back to work. The other parties aren't going to win. That is clear. But they should still be going through kind of transition planning. You basically take some of your key people and you separate them out from the campaign, and they focus on nothing but transition. And there are interactions, especially as you get closer to the end of the campaign, with the civil service, so you can hit the ground running if you choose to do so.
So what should be the priority then, John Tory, in terms of that key message? I mean, it's important to say, on a campaign, we're here to protect Ontario, but there has to be something substantial coming out and quickly.
But that's the point, Dave. It goes from theater, and I don't mean to be cynical in saying when Mr. Ford goes to Washington with the others, it's not all theater, but there's an element of theater to it because it's an election campaign. And then all of a sudden the election's over, you won, and you have the responsibility. And I think it divides into two things. The first is to continue the advocacy, because that part is just beginning. I mean, as others have said a few minutes ago, we're only just maybe beginning to get the slightest bit of attention from American decision makers. So I think the advocacy continues. I think secondly, if it's going to be a great moment for us in the context of getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers and all this stuff that's going to be good for Canada and should have happened 25 years ago, that has to be proceeded with if it can be. And then thirdly, of course, is substantive measures to provide relief and support and protection for Ontario people and businesses. I mean, if you're going to protect Ontario, then you got to actually do it when you get elected again, and that's going to involve measures that Mr. Ford said from the outset would be expensive and would be complicated in terms of who gets the help and all that. So there's lots to do, and they're going to have to proceed ahead with it because this crisis is only just beginning as opposed to ending.
Keith, if we get to that point, though, and I can see where there's a certain, I know I can feel, you can feel the fatigue among people. I mean, there's we're being inundated with the pressures and the threat and all of the news. And I talking to a lot of people saying, I just got to turn it off for a while. I can't handle the being inundated with that level of anxiety all the time. And there's a sense of it. So when the election's over, we, the voters, kind of say, okay, I've done my bit. We're moving on. Here's the problem that I see for all of the worries on a daily basis and the issues that we've identified as the top 3 or 4, and then tariffs, they get backburnered again in the first part of this government because the focus will then still be on tariffs, which I'm not suggesting we shouldn't. But healthcare is really a problem. There's still a lineup for doctors in Walkerton. All of those things don't go away.
No, I think what we'll see, and I expect to see actually, is something like, a first 100-day plan. Here's what our government's going to do in the first 100 days. And as Tim said, to get the civil service on side probably in the next week or so. Here's some things we really need to get done, that we really want to get done to show that we're tackling some stuff. So just before or during the election, they had Dr. Philpott, going to address the family doctor shortage. Okay, well, then let's get to the closures of emergency departments in smaller communities, because it's happening way, way, way too often. And people are scared. They're scared if they need an emergency room on an evening or an overnight. How far are they going to have to drive? In what kind of weather conditions? So this is a huge, huge issue. They need to address that as well. Homelessness, I mean, they need to come back and say exactly how they're going to help the towns clear these encampments and get the services for people. I mean, we all know the goal, but we have no details on how this is actually going to get done. Something that they can attack in the first 100 days, and something as well, they have to do something on their signature housing file. I mean, the latest stats came out for January. Again, we're below the national average. We've built the fewest homes that we've ever built in January. What is going on with the housing file in Ontario? This was a signature program for the Ford government. They need to do something to get that back on track. And as I say, something, right, as you say, a lot of people are tuned out, and especially with the President Trump just coming nonstop with all this stuff. It's so much, it's rattling people. They don't want to watch the news or anything. But government still has to act, and I think they have to act quickly in that first 100 days or whatever period they pick to show that they really got some major issues that they were criticized on during the campaign. They need to address them. And, there's some very vulnerable things in the healthcare sector. They need to take some serious action and show at least they've got a plan to address them, not just, hiring Dr. Philpott.
Well, the final week, then, John Wright, when we look at the getting the vote out is going to be the issue. But I think you've already made the point. Getting the vote out. Somebody yesterday said, get the shovel out, get the snowblower out, everything else that goes with it. This is a different get the vote out effort.
It is. Weather could play a big difference. But you know what? You get the sense that with the federal lift and the Liberals now, somewhat in the game, although the more Trudeau shows up announcing things, the worse I think it's going to get for him. I mean, he's the guy that nobody really wants to see, and it does hurt the Liberals every time he's there. So, and that high-speed train is, I think, has been announced for the last. I think I was born
since 1985.
Yeah, like
he said it's
there's
real
an
this
election coming. God. So here's what I would say. I think you've actually got all 3 parties and their voters open to getting out and voting. It's not like they're sitting on their hands. All of us have seen campaigns where there are no signs in neighborhoods, where people, in fact, if you come off the last campaign when Ford, called it, and we were in a post-pandemic, nobody really wanted to go and vote. I think you've got issues now where people are fired up and they want to go and legitimately vote. So there will be a desire to get out. There will be a desire to get people out and drive them to, or get them to the polls. The issue to me is how fast the Ford government's going to come back to the ledge and how fast it's going to actually pivot to some of these other issues. I'll be interested to see the following, Dave. Afterwards will be, when does the legislature come back? When does it have its throne speech? What are the priorities? Will the cabinet stay the same? Now's the time to shuffle it, because if you're going to go back with the same crew, you're going to stick with the same things for the next period of time. do you take emissaries and you find 28 MPs that you got nothing for them to do and say, hey, any of you guys got roots in any of the other provinces? So what we'll do is divide you into 3, and each one of you take a province, and you're going to reach out to the chambers of commerce out there. There's a lot of innovation that can happen now because it's not just business as usual. So I think the last week of this campaign is going to be, yes, focused on getting the vote out, but more importantly, it's going to be the battle between the Liberals and the NDP to see who, in fact, can get the many ridings that Bob talked about, who's going to win those stakes, because that, in fact, is going to determine who the opposition party is, and it's going to be maybe a lot different than it was before.
Well, I think it might have been Brian Lilly was on this week, and he was suggesting that some of the Tory strategy is to go out to ridings where there's no possibility of them winning, just they want to have the Liberals and the NDP duking it out and split the vote. So, I mean, that's some pretty nuanced stuff out there. But, again, back just before we go to the question of how quickly does this government have to come back? I mean, it's almost as if we need, I dare say in italics and bold, a war cabinet to deal with some of the stuff that's going on economically south of the border. So we can't bring back the same cabinet, can we, Bob?
Oh, I think a lot of the key players, they've got a lot of pretty solid people in that cabinet. Peter Bethlenfalvy, I think, is a very good finance minister, as somebody I think any party would be happy to have running on his ticket. I think their labor minister has been very solid, Dave Piccini. So I think there's a number of people in economic portfolios. Vic Fideli's been a good salesman for Ontario on the road. I ran into him in Washington just a month ago. This is they've got a pretty good team there. They will reconstitute it and make a few changes here and there, but they've got a pretty solid team, a pretty solid leadership at the Premier's office, so they can proceed, I think, on a pretty fast basis. They also have good relations with the present federal government. Now that is in the process of changing, but I think a lot of those relationships they've built up are helpful to them too, as well as they kind of reorganize themselves for the next phase.
Yeah, it'll be just interesting, John Tory, to see how that dynamic plays. I mean, Ford and Poilievre, Ford and Carney, how does all of that kind of play into it as well? Even yesterday, the idea of, okay, if we win and we have Poilievre, it's not necessarily going to be an easy ride for a Ford government in Ontario. It might be better to have Carney in the seat.
Yeah, and but I think all this talk about whether they come back sooner or later really won't matter much, because let's remember, and this is another instance where Premier Ford and look, it's better to be lucky than smart, and he's both, but he's been lucky with Trump coming along and replacing the old enemy of Trudeau and this kind of stuff. But now the luck will be in his court again, in that the day after the Ontario election's over, the attention will all shift to the federal leadership, Liberal leadership race, and the new prime minister and new government. And so Doug Ford will have the latitude to say, I'm either going to come back and get going and be seen to get going, or just say, no, I'll wait and see who's going to be in the big chair for the time being in Ottawa. And so I think, once again, he'll be lucky in that he'll have that choice and doesn't necessarily have to rush back and can say, look, let's wait and see what happens federally and all that. And then, of course, there's going to be a federal election not too long after it, maybe in the fall, maybe in the spring. It looks more like the spring, and the tension will shift there again. So I think, he will have a lot of options open to him.
All right, well, let's leave it there, and there'll be still lots to talk about between now and next Friday, which is the day after the election. So thanks to Keith Leslie, John Wright, Tim Hudak here, Bob Richardson, and John Tory. It's always good to have you guys around the table, and we'll be back at it again tomorrow. It is the daily edition of On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. And if you are watching on YouTube, you can just follow the subscribe to the channel, or you can listen to us on Apple, iHeart, Spotify, etc. Leave us a comment, and if there's something in the program that you want to comment on, go to my website, davetrafford.com, and hit the talk back message button. Leave us a note, and we'll be happy to included in programs. We're getting all kinds of interesting feedback on the YouTube comments as well, and some really thoughtful stuff in terms of how we see ourselves vis-a-vis against the Americans and what's going on in there and how that's playing into our politics. So thanks for engaging. All right, that'll do it. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.